Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over the best decks for the NAIC. I normally just do a straight top 10, but because there's so many different ways to play Dragapult and Lost Zone at this point, I feel like I'm just going to go over the ones that I think are worth talking about, and we're going to get straight into it because I am flying today and I need to get this done. So let's start with Miraidon Iron Hands. You can see the PTCG Live popularity rank as well as their amount of points earned at the top, and then we have a very brief overview of the matchup spread. I'm not going to go through every single one. Also in the bottom left corner, if it's relevant, I've got the Sapporo as well as the Japanese Nationals placements for these decks. So Miraidon did get a first place in the list, so I thought it was definitely worth mentioning because it's obviously won already a monster tournament in this metagame, although it was right at the beginning of it. Some of the most important matchups to bear in mind is that you're quite poor into Raging Bolt Ogerpon, which is one of the main things keeping people away from Miraidon, but it's kind of offset by the very high win rate into the Lugia matchup. So you are trying to certainly hit more Lugias than Bolts, and otherwise you're still this aggressive, consistent archetype. And you also have some game into control, which is also like a decent boast for you. The reason why Guardian, Lost Zone, Box are even is because, you know, obviously your hands can get into the mix early. If it's answered, sometimes you can fizzle. Otherwise, you are just going to ramp through and get into the game. So the main sort of notes I have with my deck list, the sort of changes from the successful Sapporo 60, is that I've added in Vitality Band because the combination of Zapdos plus Vit Band actually gets you to 240. You already have Prime Catcher, Vacuum, and Bundle, and obviously a high boss count and Prime Catcher. So yes, there are going to be 290 hit points Raging Bolts, but I think you can find the opportunity to find Zapdos Vit Band for when they only have 240, and otherwise you can be bundling, priming, all this other stuff to make it work. So I think having one very easy way to KO a Raging Bolt is enough, especially because you still have Raichu in the deck that can be like your last two prizes, for example. Plus, Vitality Band has other utility, just like Zapdos. We've seen how it can be helpful for Miraidon getting to 230, except it doesn't force the Zapdos into play and saves a bench space, which is still important in the deck list. The other thing I've added is Iono. I think Iono is amazing into the Lost Zone variants, the Gardevoir variants, all the Stage 2 decks actually that like to amass hand sizes, certainly Dragapults and such. So you can be aggressive and still have Iono at your disposal to slow the opponent down. When you're already playing Tatsugiri, it makes sense to have a split of supporters, in my opinion, because then you can cherry pick the right one for the right occasion. So this allows you to still be aggressive, but then also throw Hand Disruption in the mix. And as we know, that can be an insane combination if some of these Pokemon are left unchecked. So that's the main decisions within my 60. For other options, I think Blood Moon Ursaluna is definitely worth thinking about because this is just a great card when you are starting to fizzle. If your generators haven't popped off, or even if they have and you've just gone for a crazy Raichu play, you can then look for the Blood Moon to close out the game. Also, we're playing quite thin counts of our Pokemon, so you could definitely consider Hisuian Heavy Ball in the deck list. We have so many one-ofs that cherry picking these is going to be pretty important as well. So these are cards that I wouldn't mind fitting in. They are certainly powerful, but I haven't really found the space for them, and we need to play like 17 spaces for energy. So you're always trying to thin it down as much as possible because at the end of the day, your win rate is tied to your generator hits. Let's get into Charizard. Bit of a fall from grace, really. It's really cooled off in terms of popularity as well as its placements. And its matchup data looks pretty atrocious for what used to be the best deck in formats. I think you do have a decent time into the Raging Bolts, and obviously you're happy to see Miraidon. Gardevoir's still close. Their Monkey Dory math fixing can be a little bit frustrating now. But the main thing to kind of be concerned about as Charizard is that you're not great into the new threat of Dragapult. You lose ground into Lugia. There's still the controlling decks out there, so yeah, there's still a lot of matchups that just aren't great for you. It feels like the field won't necessarily revolve around Charizard, but the field will just naturally not be that ideal for you. You're gonna have to slog through a lot of these situations with that Charizard deck, just hoping that your internal consistency and hand disruption is going to be like the strongest elements of this archetype. For my main changes, we have to change the Ace Spec to Maximum Belt, I feel, because the Dragapult matchup is so poor. But having Defiance Band, Max Belt, and Kieran in the decklist does give us a little bit better reach into these other EX matchups a little bit quicker. And I think specifically against Dragapult, that's going to be really important because they're usually trying to finagle a prize map to stay out of range and then take, you know, like 3 or 4 prize sweeps towards the end game. So having that extra reach for your Burning Darkness is critical. In addition to that, you can see that I'm playing high hit point Pokemon. I've got 70 hit point Bidoof in here, and I've got the 60 hit point Pidgey. That's because I'm fearful of both Lost Zone and regular Dragapult decks, especially if they play TM Devolution. So having these extra hit points around means that you're not getting multiple Pokemon cleared off by one Devo as easily. You're forcing an extra turn of Dragapult, or at least some shenanigans, or an extra turn of Lost Mine, or at least some shenanigans. So yeah, I think the extra hit points is relevant. Yes, Call for Family Pidgey is pretty busted, but I saw Daichi at the Japanese Nationals playing these higher hit point basics, and I think it made a lot of sense. I've also cut Cleffa for Tatsugiri. I think Cleffa is just too dangerous right now because 30 hit points gets punished by Guardy, which is one of the most popular archetypes, Dragapult and Lost Zone. So that's a lot of the high-end decks right now in the format. 3 of the top 5 decks, I would say, all punishing Cleffa to like a huge extent. So I think the Tatsugiri, although possibly weaker than the Cleffa overall, can still be a decent proactive card. And, similar to Mew in the past, has that great pivot option alongside the Infernal Rain ability, so you can still just move in and out of it even without a rescue board in the list. So that's kind of the main changes. Also playing the Temple of Sinnoh to respect Lugia as best we can, but it's still difficult. Essentially it's a very difficult juggle for Charizard to fit everything it wants to and still be a powerful top contender right now. For other options, there's still a lot for the Charizard. I just talked about why I like Tatsu over Cleffa, but if you want to still play the Cleffa, you can for potentially other matchups, or just accept the fact that you're going to give up easier prizes later down the line. Power Pad's obviously interesting. We're playing a low count of our supporter cards, so that could be reasonable. Canceling Cologne if you want to respect the Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon, which could go into the Raging Bolt deck. At the moment, I'm playing No Answer, so that would be another bad matchup as long as you face someone who is teching for Charizard. Don't know why they would, because it's certainly not going to be popular enough in my opinion. But if the Raging Bolts are going to play it, it has been seen online, you can be proactive and play the Canceling Cologne. And then just a few other techs. The Mist Energy can be more defense into the Devo play, can be helpful in other situations as well. Obviously, protecting against Dragapult counter placement in the first place, or Sableye placement. So yeah, those are reasonable. And then League Headquarters, again, another Daichi card that I saw played in his 60. And, if we're expecting a lot of Lost Zone Dragger or just regular Lost Zone box, the HQ is helpful. And every now and then it can be a disruptor against the Raging Bolt decks as well, where you can do a hand disrupt plus HQ and hope to catch them off guard. So that might improve your Bolt matchup that little bit more and become a bit more of a selling point in the deck overall. Next up we have Block Snorlax. This has got a fairly low amount of popularity but a decent amount of placements. It is a little bit concerned with some of the Dragapult variants in the mix, and Lugia being so high profile is also quite a concern. The Gardevoir players are also likely playing double Churro at the moment, so these are kind of the worst matchups. But I do think it still has a decent number of boasts in there as well. Most notably, it's good into the Raging Bolt deck, which I think is pretty interesting. So, as we know, are still reasons to want to play the Block Snorlax deck. It did gain some cool new cards, including the accompanying Flute. The main things I've tried to incorporate into the deck list is a couple Giacomo alongside that double Temple of Sinnoh. We're just kind of hoping that can help out against the Lugia as much as possible. But yeah, it's still going to be a really, really tough matchup for you overall. For other options, we've seen Morwell in there in the past, and it can be reasonable once again. And Thornton could be another way to sort of fix your board or recover Pokemon as well. It also gives you a bit of prize coverage. If you have prized your Super Rod, you can then put other Pokemon into play and then just Thornton into like your next Snorlax, or get Mimikyu back or Sandshrew, those sorts of things as well. So those are cards that I'm kind of interested in. If you want to sack Lugia altogether, I think that's like reasonable, although a huge risk for the NEIC. You can cut those Copium Giacomo and just go for these cards instead. Keeping on the control train, we have the Pidgeot control variant. Has a lot of unfavorables, actually, notably not great into some of the Dragapult builds. Gardevoir seems like it got a little tougher, again, with those Churros coming into the mix. Lugia being tough. For some reason, the data has Snorlax Block being a hard matchup. I don't really see it myself, but yeah, that's what the data's coming out with right now. So there's a lot of matchups that aren't great for Pidgeot, but as we saw from the last format, Pidgeot was just thriving in the hands of great players, and I think this deck is complex and difficult to play, so that also might be swaying some of the percentages here. What I will say is, yes, Dragapult definitely pressurizes your engine quite aggressively, and that's something I would be fearful of. And there aren't that many like great boast matchups. Yes, it's nice to be decent into Raging Bolts. Yes, Charizard's okay, and then some of the other Dragapult builds. The Trainer Hill data is really weird. It lumps Xatu and Pidgeot for some reason, but separates Lost Zone and Charizard. But yeah, that's a Limitless / Trainer Hill issue, I suppose. But yeah, I'm trying to still give you a decent picture of Pult. Plus, there's already like 3 different Dragapults on every slide, so it's already going to be taking up a large part of this graphic in your decision making, I suppose. But yeah, Pidgeot is risky, I think, going into this format with some more awkward matchups, but we know it has the pedigree behind it. Some of the cool stuff that's sort of come into the deck list as of late, the Great Tusk is an answer to Min and Cinccino. Then we have the Ogerpon, which is a higher hit point version of Mawile with that Sob. You can do it for 0 damage with DTE. And we also have the Blood Moon Ursaluna EX as well for another like high hit point Radzard option, essentially, which is, again, just a very powerful card when we have such great hit point buffs, and it allows you to sweep similar to the Radzard. So yeah, the other things to bear in mind, cancelling clones in the deck list for the Cornerstone Ogerpon EX as well, so you can damage your way through that card. Beyond that, it's very similar to previous builds where you have that huge array of supporter cards and lots of power pad to insta-quick search them back into the hand when required for the right situation. And yeah, still a dangerous archetype. Even though its data is looking pretty sus, I think it's a risk at the NEIC, but as we know, this has the kind of options to still do well in a far-reaching format, I think. Into other options, Thornton has been good in the past in the archetype, just making space for it is the big question mark. Same thing for the Ericas. And the Regieleki, another like strong attacking option, and if you respect like control mirrors, this can also be a really big card, as you're both going to be Santering against each other, but Regieleki does get around that with the first attack, so something to bear in mind. Let's go on to Lost Zone box. There's so many ways we can play Lost Zone at the moment, so again, the data is kind of weird because it's also lumping like the Radzard Lost boxes with normal Lost boxes. There's some that play Dark Energy, some that don't, so it is still a little bit up in the air, but its data is looking really promising, and its results recently have also kind of backed that up in online tournaments. Sableye is really good right now because basically all the Stage 2s can't fit Jirachi because they're so worried about other matchups. So that just gives Sableye a bit of a clear runway, really, to Lost Mine to its heart's content, which is pretty nice. You have a decent number of switching cards, which can help against Block and Pidgeot, even though the regular Snorlax is still a little bit of a tricky matchup. You can represent nice one-prize boards, so you can be decent into the Raging Bolt at times. You're obviously threatening that Gardevoir, but they are still going to be hand disrupting you to high heaven, so bear that in mind. Yeah, overall it seems like a reasonable matchup spread and is just a little bit more consistent, I think, at what it's trying to do with Sableye not being blocked anymore. That's why I'm actually going up to the second copy of Sableye and adding TM Devolution to my build right now. I previously had Town Store Pokestop in here, but I have gone to Sinnoh just because I am fearful of Lugia and their missed energies more than anything else. But also, of course, you can hit Legacy at the same time. It's kind of copium to try and find the Sinnoh at the right time, but I feel like it's still worthwhile trying in the deck list. You do have Forest Hill Stone to maybe get towards it, and Roxanne in the sort of mid to late, which is kind of the most pressing time to find your Sinnoh, I suppose. So that's something I'm bearing in mind. I've also gone up to double Vacuum to just reach that 10 that little bit faster. Even just reaching 7 faster is huge, so you can get towards that Iron Hands. This is kind of like Hermione's Stockholm list as well, where I've got the Rotom V, because I do think you want to go first as this list, end on instant charge, and give yourself the best chance to get a turn 2-7 in that Lost Zone. So yeah, that's the way I'm trying to play, like a turbo-y build that gets to 10 pretty quickly. Because I've cut down to 3 Super Rod, I am playing a 3-3-3 energy split, even though you don't need that Psychic that badly. It's just so you have a number of different coloured energy in your deck, rather than playing like a 4th Water or yeah, just going down to like 2 Lightning and like 4 Psychic or anything like that. I think the 3-3-3 makes sense when I'm playing triple Rod, just for gate synergies more than anything else. But yeah, Sableye is looking really dangerous in this format, so I like stripping back the attacking suites and getting rid of Roaring Moon, knowing you're going to try and, instead of going for like high damage output with a multi-prizer in that matchup, you're going to try and Sprinkle and Devo instead. So it does neaten up the list that little bit. If you want to play a dark package, I do think Monkey Dory is also very powerful. It can really upset the apple cart for the Dragapult player. Whilst having Switch Cart and Adrenabrain at your disposal, you can undo a lot of their math, whilst also setting up numbers for yourself. Roaring Moon EX is, of course, still a powerful attacker. It can be a great endgame attacker as well, just where you don't care about your own damage counters being put on the gouging because you've won the game. So yeah, and if you don't believe in the Copium Temple of Sinnoh, you can go for Pokestop as well. Very quick, very out of left field list as well that I've literally just started trying over the last couple of days, which I thought was pretty cool, is a Sablezard. I think Sablezard is also very powerful right now because it is also a great thing that can loop Sableye, which is really what it's always tried to do. The sort of new technology that I'm attempting here is having Monkey Dory Dark Energy to help your Lost Mine Devo strats and just make Cramorant more of a dangerous attacker, alongside Magma Basin. So you can trigger this yourself with Radzard or Entei being powered up on the bench and at least throw 2 counters across the board, which also helps Combustion Blast become a more dangerous number. But of course, when you're up against the Dragapults, you're then going to have your switch carts at the 4 count and Monkey Dory, so you can come out the gate swinging in that matchup and also have some like backup play available to you. I am playing a 2-2 barrel in here as well. I do feel like if you're playing a Lost Zone deck, it is pretty important to be aware of Unfair Stamp, and also just Iono in general. And I always thought that was one of the weaknesses of Sablezard, but this really came about because I was testing the Dragapult EX Lost Zone build and just loved having Drakloak on my board. And I've actually done this before in formats way gone by where I had a thin barrel package in Sablezard, and I'm doing it again, and I think it definitely makes sense. Let me know what you think about this one, because this is mostly just like my creation that I'm still raw with and still experimenting with, so there certainly might be counts that you might want to change, but I did think this was a really cool prospect that I wanted to sort of just present. Because, again, I just think the Sableye is insane right now, and I think Monkey Dory actually does have more synergy than you might think on the surface with a Lost Zone variant, because obviously you're very rarely leaving counters in play, but having the Basin kind of works with the Zard. Very cheeky list that I'm still trying to iron out, but I think there's something here potentially, and I think Sableye is just insane right now. It's basically the long story short. On to Dragapult, because this is why the whole top 10 thing kind of fell by the wayside, because the data's really weird for Pult, because it's split between, like, Pidgeot and Xatu win rate goes together, the Charizard win rate and Lost Zone win rate of Dragapult are separated, so if you combine the results of Dragapult, it's the 3rd best performing archetype on PTG Live. It has had some decent placements in Sapporo, and its popularity is kind of all over the place. The most popular builds are the Xatu and Pidgeot. That's, again, combining the 2 of them. Then we have the Lost Zone build, and then finally the Charizard build all the way down to, like, 17th in terms of popularity. So there's a lot of this to go over. Let's jump straight into it. We're going to start with a Pidgeot build. You have to play Neo Upper in the Pidgeot 60. The other things to bear in mind is that I am playing Churro Kieran to give yourself some protection against the controlling matchup. The Featherball was a great idea from Shintaro, as was the Hawlucha. This allows your Phantom Dive to just be much more dangerous, so I really liked those choices in the deck list. I am still playing Temple of Sinnoh, even though, you know, it turns off Neo Upper, and that's a concern for you. I still feel like it's going to be important for the Lugia matchup, so much so, and I think it's so much better than E-Hammer, actually, because you're targeting lots of things at once, plus you also catch other mists in the crossfire as well. So yeah, this is my Pidgeot's build of Dragapult. Admittedly, this is one of my lower played ways to play Pult. I have tried a lot of the other stuff, and I think the matchup data isn't that appealing for Dragapult. Again, you have to remember that this is combining the Pidgeot data with the Xatu data, so some of that could be getting mixed in with each other. But ultimately, the win rates aren't looking super appealing for this approach. I do feel like this is very setup based. I have seen lists that are incorporating even more lines of like Big Barrel, and personally, I'm not a huge fan of this. I feel like you should just have a thicker line of your Drakloak, because I think, obviously, this ability is good. Like, it's not as powerful in a vacuum as the Big Barrel, but your board space is often going to be taken up by other stuff anyway, and just having multiple threats established on board is still really important to me. So yeah, I think this is a reasonable archetype, but I do think it is a little bit underpowered personally. As for other options within the Pidgeot build, I am playing Radzard in like most of my Pults, but Alakazam plus Devo is powerful, and if we're expecting lots of stage 2s, that could be really important. I think Radiant Alakazam is really big for the Gardevoir matchup, and Gardevoir has really started to uptick and become exceptional, and I think a lot of the time people are playing against Dragapult builds that are now moving towards Radzard. I think it's a very calculated risk, because obviously without Radzard you're very weak into Raging Bolt, but with Radiant Alakazam you're very, very strong with Dragapult into Guardy, because now you can tick into Curliers, and you're undoing a lot of their like Monkey Dory math fixing. You're sort of undoing it back to them, so it becomes a very mathy matchup. But I think the Zam and Devo can be very powerful then for the other stage 2 matchups, and you much improve your Gardevoir which I think is currently like close, so bear that in mind. You can add a small TM Evo package into this list as well. If you want to have that thin bit barrel, a 1/1 Xatu, or even just have a 2/1/2 Pidgeot line, you can play 1 TM Evolution. The reason why I don't do that is that you're only playing 7 energy plus 2 Vessel, so your odds of actually getting that Evo turn 1 going second isn't all that high. So I've gone against that line, but what's cool about having TM Evo is it actually helps you out against TM Devo by going straight into Pidgeotto, and it also means that if you're getting attacked early with, for example, a Dragapult, your Pidgey isn't just getting knocked out immediately, you have 80 hit points on that Pidgeotto, so there are selling points there, which I think are pretty cool. Additionally, if you want to do the 101 Charizard package, that's also a very cool idea, where it gives you that little bit extra acceleration on top of your Neo and your Mela, and at the same time you have that late game beat stick. We've seen 101 packages of Charizard work in the past, and there is enough synergy within this list to possibly make those spaces. If you want to have Roseanne's backup, you can reuse your Stadium as well as your tools. You know, the Defiance Band is a really big one, and at the same time you can get back Neo Upper, which is huge, so you can just back up and then immediately quick search for the Upper, which can again be really helpful to just reload your efficient attacker. And Lost Vacuum is just a good card that's in a lot of deck lists. Again, if you respect Gardevoir, you could definitely think about including this into the list. Also pretty good against like Raging Bolt and Control and all that other stuff. So yeah, powerful option that you could certainly consider. Let's look at the Draga Xatu list. My list hasn't changed for a week or so, but I do still think there are great merits around this archetype. Xatu has been absolutely trashed online, and everyone says it's just abysmal. I don't really agree, because I do think this is still one of the best ways that you can fix your board to that all one prize sort of situation, where then you can be checkmating. And I think with Dracloaks, Xatu, and Tatsugiri, you have a very, very robust single prize board state that can get you over the line quite often. So I think this is unfairly judged in that it's still one of the like decent consistency ways to play the deck, has internal synergy, and makes the most out of Radzard like over the other 60s. So this one I think gets a bad rap, but yeah, I know people are trying other builds all over the place. This list hasn't changed for me. I feel like it's still in a really good spot, and I don't really want to change a card. The only thing I would think about with this exact 60 is I'm not playing the Kirin or the Churro, so I'm a little bit weaker against the controlling matchups, but that would be the only thing to sort of bear in mind with this list. I'm still pretty content with it. If you want to make a cut, you can go down to 3 Dracloak if you really want to, but it is a bit of a risk. But if you are trying to weave in some of the supporters, you can. And they're actually on this slide right here. Again, I'm going to make that same argument. This deck especially really needs to play Rad Charizard, but the Radzam could go in the deck list. Again, if you're just thinking about certain matchups, if you're thinking there's going to be a critical mass of stage 2s and Dragapult influx, the Devo Zam could give you an edge. If you do go to Radzam, you then have to play Blood Moon Ursaluna. You basically have to play a little differently, because obviously Ursaluna's a 2-prizer, unlike the Zard. So your sort of break points in when you can weave this card in is different. But if you want to make that change of Radiant, you then have to play the Blood Moon, so you have some late game high damage output as well. In terms of different items, again, I'm not fitting Vacuum, but it's a powerful card right now. And I'm playing the Cyclone over Stamp. Cyclone is good in like Mirror and Guardian, a few other situations. Stamp is very good against the aggro archetypes and makes your Arven just more consistent, I suppose. Turns Arven into not just a tutor card, but also a consistency plus disruption card. And that is very tempting, no doubt about that. If you are going to Stamp, you then have to certainly include at least Churro and probably Kirin as well, just to have extra pivot cards within the deck list, because you're obviously cutting the Cyclone right now. Those are things to bear in mind. Let's go on to the Draga Zard, which has much more interesting matchup data, I think. Much more appealing matchup data, I should say, where its numbers are looking far stronger and far more competitive. My concern with Draga Zard is that its engine is very rickety, I would say. The list I'm playing right now is again playing the thick Pulse. I think I prefer 4/4 Dreepy Dracloak, even though I'm playing 3 Candy and obviously trying to Candy into Dragapult a decent amount of time, because I prefer having that thick line of Pokemon and having the threat of Dragapult the entire game, rather than having that thinner line of Dragapults and then weaving in like a thin Pidgeot or a thin Bibarel. That's my own personal debate, but again, if you want to play that Bibarel, it's a higher value draw card, but it's very like limited into what it can and can't do. I still think Tatsugiri is really important for this list. because, again, we're really reliant on those Arven in the opening stages. I still really like Rotom, by the way. Rotom's not in like every list I'm seeing, and it's because you are choosing to go second and trying to Evo, but of course you are going to be forced first in a lot of situations at the NAIC, because quite a few decks do want to go second, so bear that in mind. Other things to note, I'm playing E-Search rather than Vessel, just because discarding cards is quite tough in this list, and obviously you can already thin your fires via Charizard in theory, so the E-Search is basically just trying to get Psych Energy on most occasions, but every now and then it can get the fire. Just a very tiny, minute thing to bear in mind there, where we are trying to min-max where we can. But yeah, this is my list of the Zard Pult, which does have very good data behind it. Just one to note there. Even though it's the least played, it's the highest win rate, I think, apart from the Lost Zone. Again, for other options, I'm still going to keep preaching Zam Devo is powerful and dangerous, especially because so many people have tested against Zard now that their board is much more constricted as soon as you start threatening Alakazam, or even Hawlucha to an extent as well, because they just can't bench stuff anymore if you are threatening 80 coming out at them on any given turn of the game. Bibarel, like I said, if you value this over the thicker Dragger line, you can go down to like a 3-2-2 Dragapult, and then have like Bibarel as a 1-1 or 2-2 count if you really want to. And again, there's the Vacuum and the Kira, and the cards that I'm basically not fitting into the deck list, but you can concede the space and fit them in because they are power cards. Let's go on to, again, another one that has the best matchup data right now, which is the Lost Dragapult. I love Sableye right now. It has synergy with Dragapult. I love Charizard right now. It has synergy with Pult as well, in that you can have a board state of just Comp Phase Dracloaks, and again, you have that amazing one prize board, and you can reload Zard as well when you're already playing the double Rod. So I think there's a lot of strengths here. The very cheeky thing that I've done is added an A-Spec Arven to make the E-Hammer that tiny bit more searchable when you are up against the Lugia matchup, which is very, very copium, but Arven essentially is a boss's orders when you have Countercatcher and Prime both in the deck list. It also gives you a little bit more access to Candy, which I'm also playing at a very cheeky 1 count. A lot of the time I'm slow-volving my Dracloak whilst I'm swinging with Cram and stuff, so that's kind of just a mentality thing. Again, I like Rotom Forest. I think it synergizes really nicely with this engine. This Dragapult list is very happy going first as well, which again capitalizes on the Rotom compared to the other Dragapult lists, which much, much prefer going second and then kind of just have that Rotom in case they go first. This one's a little bit more like happy to Rotom because Forest is so busted for getting that chorus as well. So yeah, I think this is some of the highest win rate Dragger, and I think it's certainly powerful. The Arven is very cheeky, and I am cutting corners by having it, because I'm only playing one boss, and I think a second boss or second Countercatcher is very valid. But I think Arven is a slight, a tiny inch of extra consistency that you can add into the deck. For other options, Defiance Band is just a powerful card anyway, and TM Devo synergizes with Pult and Sableye, and I've just been preaching how good Lost Mine is right now when there's not enough Jirachi really being fit into lists, so you can cash in on that even more if you want to. Again, Vacuum, synergy with the Lost Zone engine, and just a good card in general. And Ultra Ball, because we are playing that thin Dragapult, and I think one Ultra Ball is better than playing a third Dragapult EX, even though you have like more awkward flower selectings, I suppose, because the Ultra Ball can also get you Rotom in the opening stages. And yeah, I think it's just a better card in the deck, more flexible. Let's finish our tirade on Pult and move on to Raging Bolt, one of the other new archetypes coming out. Had a great run at the Japan Championships. Got second place and a top 4 placement. It's the most popular deck online and the second best performing deck online. Its matchup data is also pretty interesting. It is concerned about Gardevoir, and it's got a couple other awkward matchups in there. It's a bit iffy into Lugia. It's a bit iffy into the Pult. But its consistency kind of just puts it still within that unfavorable range rather than like hard bad matchups, I would say. And it also boasts a couple good matchups into the other Dragapult builds, very good into Miraidon, decent into Charizard and Lost Box as well. Essentially, it's just a super consistent, I'm doing my thing, can you keep up with me against every matchup? And that's like a really appealing thing to be, where you're not overly teching too much as we get to the deck list. It's really just trying to be the problem and just say, can you keep up with everything I'm trying to do? The bundle plus Prime Catcher plus Double Boss is where I'm at, but there are some people playing Flip Catches if they really want to. Sandy Shocks can be that early game prod machine just to get through evolving basic Pokemon and Convey and whatnot, and force the opponent to have their Counter Catchers and all that other stuff. And yeah, it's a very consistent beatdown archetype, and I think this will be performing well at the NAIC, even though, you know, we are seeing the Radzards out there, we are seeing the Gardevoir, there are these awkward matchups. I think you're still that pace setter deck in a best of three, which is just so appealing. Looking at some of the other options, the Cornerstone Ogerpon, if you want to tech for Charizard, you can. I just certainly wouldn't do that. Sandy Shocks is more on-board damage and gives you an extra ancient Pokemon that just sits in play, so when a Raging Bolt is KO'd, you know you're still getting full Sada value the next turn, so it's not just like a 70 damage Pokemon that sits in play, it's actually a 140 damage Pokemon if you think about it in that logic, where in the late game you're getting put down to low hand sizes, you know that you can Absorption plus Sada onto like your other Bolts and this Shocks immediately. So as long as you do hit that Sada, it is just a little bit more damage to help you push over that line. If you want to wait catches, you can. I just don't want to risk my NAIC on coin flips. And Tracking Shoes kind of weave into the deck list. I have had them in between like a more towards like a 2 count more often than not, just to wiggle in cards, but now I'm like more set in stone on what counts I want for everything else, so I've sort of weeded out the Shoes. But if you want to put them back in, or if you just have a space and you don't know what to do with them, Shoe is probably just the best card that can go in the list at this point. Going on to Gardevoir, this is the third most popular and the best performing deck in our online tournaments. It got second at the Sapporo Champions League and a top 8 in the most recent Japan Nats. It has a lot of even matchups. You see I had to wiggle around with the graph actually to show that it really doesn't have many awkward matchups. It's a little bit poor into Zard and some of the Pulse builds, but it's good into the other Pulse builds, which is weird. So yeah, I think overall Gardevoir is just a very consistent deck, which like puts it in the mix against a lot of things. It's got reasonable control matchups because you're playing the Churro in here, and obviously your Teleportation Burst is something you could bear in mind. Yeah, I think it's just a well-rounded archetype, pretty consistent at what it's trying to do. My biggest fear factor would be Iron Hands, but surprisingly, you're like okay into Lost Box, okay into the Miraidon matchup, and favored into Lugia. So my biggest fear isn't actually that bad from the data side of things. So that's making you feel like Gardevoir is looking like a pretty good deck overall. I'm not doing anything fancy with the Gardevoir list. I think Stamp is a huge upgrade. The Double Chur is becoming more and more staple because it's good into controlling matchups and it's good into the Dragon matchup. Sometimes it's even good in Mirror. And just generally picking up your 2 prizes in late game stages, even against things like Bolt, can be huge. So yeah, I think that's a pretty staple 2 count. And the Temple of Sinnoh, I think, is worthwhile because I'm expecting lots of Lugia, and we haven't even talked about Lugia yet, so that's a sign that it's going to be a good deck. Drifloon is sometimes that 1 and 2 count, as is Monkey Dory, so I haven't quite figured out which one's more important. I think if you're expecting a lot of Pulse and even a lot of Mirror, you could go double Dory, but I think you can also just go double Drifloon and be a little bit safer in that regard. I've also thought about just going double Hisuian and keeping all the basics at 1, knowing that I will prize more basics and need to possibly Hisuian more than once a game. Sounds very, very weird, but that could be logical as well in the grand scheme of things. For other cards we could consider, Tatsugiri was in the most recent Japanese Nationals list. They weren't playing Radiant Greninja though, so you're basically spending your turn attachments on Tatsu to pay retreat, rather than spending an energy from hand to burn with Radiant Greninja. I think Greninja's slightly more powerful, but Tatsu is certainly a tempting card. The Klefki can be a little bit of early game disruption that you can retreat into or teleportation burst into, and Mimikyu is also a really tempting like protection Pokemon that can be annoying for a number of matchups. So if you want to weave those in, again, you can go down to 1 Drifloon and just add in one of these Pokemon if you think they're worthwhile. Lux Cape can be a tool card that can be a great finishing combo rather than needing Monkey Dory to have set up damage across the board, especially when there can be late game situations where you're getting hand disrupted and the monkey's not in play. Then you can be in trouble to find a big combination of cards, whereas Lux Cape can still just be Arven for, and you can get that late game Drifloon or Screamtail and just finish anything off in front of you. And then there's a few items you could still consider with the Arven package, the Hyper Aroma being that more consistency option. I've been very anti this a long time, like basically all the time I've been testing Unfair Stamp, but the more I think people will force Guardy first, the more I like the Hyper Aroma. And then you're actually allowed to choose to go first into a few matchups, like the Lugia matchup, for example, knowing that like if you just hit 1 Poffin and then on turn 2 you can Arven Aroma, you're kind of popping off and at least safeguarding yourself and getting a very robust board. So Aroma's not as bad as I initially thought, but I still wouldn't play it over Stamp, if that makes sense. Palpad, if you want to have some thin supporter lines, I'm only playing 1 boss, so you can definitely consider that. And Candy, I'm just at double Evo right now, but you can go 1 Evo, 1 Candy if you really want to still have that option within the deck list. And then finally we get to Lugia. Lugia is the second most popular online, has the fourth best overall points, but absolutely tore up both Sapporo and the Japanese national championships. It won, it got a top 4 and 2 top 8 placements. That's half the top 8 were Lugia decks at the Japanese national championships, and it also did really, really well in Sapporo as well, the earlier tournaments in this format. So Lugia is boasting a lot right now. Some of its more awkward matchups aren't that popular, like Miraidon has to worry about Raging Bolt and a few other matchups. Iron Thorns, is it even a deck? Who knows? It's kind of showing up online and is cool, but also is like a matchup roulette deck. You're slightly unfavored into Guardy, which is a concern, and Lost Zone Box, which is also a concern, but everything else seems fine. You're pretty good into the other Stage 2 archetypes. You're punishing Charizard way more than you used to. You're pretty solid into Pulse because you have so many missed energy. You can block a lot of their plays whilst threatening hands, whilst threatening high damage output from Minccino. As we know, this is just like the highest power level deck in the game, and the biggest question mark is, can I set up? That's still going to be the question mark for Lugia going into this format. So I'm not doing anything wacky with the list, really. I'm playing one copy of Carmine and still heavy research. That's from my practice, like the best I can get Lugia. I like having a potential fish option for Carmine if I have nothing else going on for me. But I still think research digging is still really important because you're basically trying to use these supporters before you've got Primal Turbo, and 5 cards really isn't a lot when you still have 16 energy in your deck that can just clunk you up, whereas the 7 cards from Research can just be that little bit more impactful. So that's really my logic around why I'm going heavy Research over Carmine. I know I'm only playing one fish, so it's not like high odds, but there are situations where it can come up. Obviously, the fish can show up in Great Balls and Aromas and stuff, and it can fix the hands, so I still feel like it's worth playing the one-of right now. And then I'm at the double jamming tower. Because Gardevoir is not the easiest matchup, I think immediately that makes jamming tower like a really obvious choice. But also it's just going to block all sorts of other things. Sometimes you're blocking Forest Seal Stone, which is like a niche early game thing, but it can be really annoying for some of the archetypes. You're going to be blocking a lot of hit point buff tools which are around. You can block like Baton against Miraidon as well. So all these things can be a pretty big deal. I've worked really hard to wiggle in one space for a third Great Ball. That's about as much I can do to add to the consistency. Also, there's a debate around 3 Lugia versus 4, and then the Minccino counts, I suppose. You can flip-flop those if you really want to. If you're expecting a decent amount of Mirror and a decent amount of Raging Bolt, you can definitely do that. But at the end of the day, you don't play the game unless you summon. So that's still my core logic as to why I'm going for 4 Lugia V instead. And then for other options, I have cut Serena. It's just not that high of an impact support card. It also has to like weave in at such weird times. It's like you've drawn too many energy in your opener and can't research away, but still have ball search for Luminion, and that ball search somehow isn't Ultra Ball or something like that. So it's a really weird sequence of things that have to happen to make Serena the right card for the right moment, which has made it be my cut. And then Roseanne's backup is interesting as well. Even if you're only getting the -1 prize effect from the Legacy once in the game, reloading Iron Hand's Legacy, and then even from certain situations you can immediately access both of those things again, is really dangerous. But again, this is one of these cards that's like really good in the bottom like 30 cards of your deck and horrific in the top 30. And I think Lugia's already pretty casino, so I don't really want to water down the deck too much. Fluttermane can help you out against Iron Thorns, but I think you're losing that matchup every single time regardless. Also just because of the decks the card comes in, if that makes sense. Like, it's going to be in Miraidon's Future Hands or just a Quad Thorns. Just the fact that you can still summon doesn't mean you're going to win that game. Not even close, I would say. And then the Wellspring Ogerpon, I feel like it's not worth the space because this deck is janky, but there's enough people not playing Ogerpon that there will be players playing against Lugia that won't put a Manaphy down. Is that the logic that makes sense to you guys? So there will be people greeding no Manaphy against Lugia, and when that situation happens, it makes Wellspring very dangerous because then you can get your full value torrential pumps. So I think it's going to be less than 50% of the Lugias will play Wellspring, but not 0. So just a warning, if you do have that extra ball search outs and you're considering holding it or getting your Manaphy, I do think it's still worth trying to protect yourself. But at the same time, I would let other Lugia players play the Wellspring for me and sneak in the extra Great Ball. That's just how I want to play the deck. So that was really the top contenders, but there are still so many more that we could be considering. Just briefly gonna mention these or give them a nod rather than like going into high detail about them. But as we've seen, the format is quite wide. There's still a lot of decks getting lots of representation in the online space. Goldengo's actually been upticking in point earnings and I think it's just ghosted above Miraidon recently, but I wanted to still talk about Miraidon because of Sapporo, and yeah, some other decks that are still kind of like in the mix and in the discussion. But I think, to be honest, I've talked about basically everything that is playable, so yeah, I'm pretty happy with the lists and the techs and the discussion around this. I know this has been a bit more of a rushed one, but I literally have to get to the airport in like half an hour, so yeah, I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you at the NAIC, and good luck to everyone playing, and yeah, cheers.